The times that were in it, Ireland in the 1920s. Welcome to the beautiful gallery in Ballinasloe Library. Our series of talks for the decade of commemorations this year is titled The Times That Were in It, and seek to look past the hard politics of the era to reflect more on social, cultural and intellectual life in Ireland in the 1920s. The decade is often viewed as simply the interlude between the world wars, or in Ireland as a period of reaction, economic challenge and social stagnation. Our speakers, Steve Dolan, Micheál O'Hea, Dr. Angus Mitchell and Dr. Emer O'Connor, will in the course of their talks cover the period concerned by focusing on sporting Ireland, visual art, local entertainments and intellectual discourse. We hope you enjoy our series of talks, which is part of the 2021 Decade of Commemorations programme.
Welcome one and all to the beautiful gallery at Ballinasloe Library here today. Our first speaker today is Steve Dolan, a local historian from Kilkiniron. He holds an MBA from NUIG and an MA in History from the University of Limerick. Steve was for many years the director of the innovative Irish Workhouse Centre in Portumna, and he is now the CEO of Galway Rural Development and a part-time lecturer in history and heritage. Steve has written dozens of articles for local history journals and has in recent years contributed hugely to local studies in County Galway through the publication of a growing collection of booklets highlighting overlooked aspects of community, commercial, sporting and military history. His talk today is Sport and its Evolution in Galway in the Revolutionary Years and Beyond. And it looks at sport in Galway during the period. Three field sports dominated in County Galway during the era: hurling camogie, Gaelic football and cricket, with the likes of rugby, hockey and association football lagging far behind. For the most part, the relationship between the different sports was quite harmonious. However, the major national and international events of the period would alter attitudes and shape the trajectory of all these sports differently. Local factors and indeed local politics would also play a major role in the growth and decline of the sports and in our perception of their legacy today.
Today I'm going to be speaking about sport, specifically in the period from 1913 to 1923. Through the prism of sport, we can view the revolutionary period in quite a different way, get a different insight to the activities that were going on, the personalities involved, and obviously I'm going to be speaking specifically about County Galway, although what was going on in Galway was part of a wider national picture. So, approaching the revolutionary period, the field sports which dominated County Galway were hurling camogie, Gaelic football and cricket, with the latter often overlooked, particularly in hurling anthologies. Other sports like rugby, association football, and hockey were lagging far behind, but they did have a place and a presence in the sporting life of Galwegians and Irish people in general. Now, for the most part, the relationship between these sports was quite harmonious. Indeed, at one stage and in different parts of the country, you had the same personalities playing 4 or 5 different sports because it was an active time and people were conscious of community and a place of belonging and so forth. But what was going to happen was that the national and international events of the revolutionary period altered attitudes and shaped the trajectory of these sports quite differently. Local factors and indeed local politics would also play a role in the growth and decline of different sports and in our perceptions of their legacy today. And this is arguably more evident in County Galway than in other counties. While the political dimension of the GAA in particular dominates discourse and indeed many publications, it should be noted that all sports were just that. They were sport. And they played a very positive social role and a very positive contribution to Irish culture and Irish society. The benefactors and the players were often one and the same, and they invested themselves, their time and their money in these activities. And clubs were in turn active in charitable efforts, and there's countless examples in County Galway and throughout the country of efforts to raise money at different sporting events for relief of the poor and so on. There were also very lively social and musical affairs with grand bands playing teams onto the field and with céilís and different festivals after particularly Gaelic games. The role of women in sport in County Galway was changing too. At the end of the 19th century, the role, you could argue, was somewhat peripheral. There certainly were underrepresented in terms of players. However, into the 20th century, women were keen, not only followers but participants, and on the basis of reported fixtures, they were increasingly active in both camogie and in cricket. So the first sport I'm going to discuss of the four we're going to touch on is cricket in County Galway. Now, the beginning of the 20th century was an interesting period for a snapshot of where the different sports were heading into the revolutionary era, or the revolutionary period. The GAA was still rife with a division following the Parnellite split. And in 1899, not a single Gaelic football or hurling club fixture was reported on in any Galway newspapers. There's reference to only one East versus West fixture in terms of hurling, while at the same time cricket was thriving. And we had Ballinasloe, which was the birthplace of cricket in 1825, still thriving. Galway, Headford, Kilconnell, Kiltartan and so on, all prominent. In Galway, its unique history is that cricket had grown from the landed estates. Over time, these estate and village sides not only drew players from the household and the class of the landlord, but also became sides populated by tenants and labourers alike. Sporting rivalry existed between estates and then counties, akin to the later GAA rivalries. And cricket and other sports enhanced a growing appreciation of borders and divisions between parishes, counties and so on. Now, as I said, while many GAA publications omit reference to cricket entirely or sometimes publish half-truths, cricket and hurling and football actually shared very many of the same personalities, not just in Galway but in other counties, and there were countless dual stars. Indeed, dual stars were evident from the very outset of the GAA. For example, 3 players from the Mealy team, which played for Galway in the first official All-Ireland of 1887, played in 1888, were first and foremost cricketers, and outstanding cricketers at that. And they were among countless others across the county. Gart's Ned Tristan, the man who was credited with inventing the modern Schlitter, when he made one acceptable to the captains of both Galway and Tipperary in 1886, was first and foremost a cricketer. And a fellow teammate of his and a fellow cricketer was Michael Cornelius Shine, founder of Tuam Stars, and he was GAA's county president here in Galway and chairman for many years either side of the century, from the 19th into the 20th. And such was the kinship in some areas that in Kilconnell it was proposed that the hurling and cricket team actually merge. However, the new century brought a provisional ban by the GAA, initially in 1983, on foreign sports, albeit there was a push and there was an exemption for cricket initially. But the respite was short-lived, and by the 1910s the tide had turned against cricket, which many people saw as incompatible with the nationalism wedded to the Catholic Church and to the GAA. In terms of hurling, prior to the establishment of the GAA in 1884, hurling was already quite active and quite popular as a sport in County Galway, and throughout the 18th and 19th century, with the digitisation of newspapers in recent years, we can see that hurling was active throughout the county. And while it did benefit from some gentry support in Galway, that was minimal in comparison to pockets in other parts of the country, certainly the exception to the rule, and in Galway the gentry focused almost exclusively on cricket. Some of the issues facing hurling in particular were recurring lawlessness, gambling, drinking, fighting, faction fights effectively, and playing on the Sabbath was also an issue. And the need for clear and safe rules is highlighted, for example, by the number of fatalities in the decade or so from 1845 to 1855. And for example, with fatalities in Clonbore, now we'd consider North Galway football area in 1842, Kilqueen or Quansborough 45, near Killimer, Cleggan again football area 46, Athenry, on Spidgill and so on. So a lot of hurling going on west of the Corrib, which is worth bearing in mind when we consider, I suppose, the myth that we have superimposed on that period that South and East Galway was all hurling and the rest was all football. It's simply not true. In terms of reporting, from 1884 there's a distribution of clubs that you can see on the map, and it shows the South and East Galway bias, but as I said, that's in terms of reporting of fixtures. And it's unlikely that what hurling was taking place west of the Corrib was ever going to be reported, given the Irish-speaking language divide and so on. Now, the GAA recovered very well, and hurling in particular, from the Parnellite split at the beginning of the century, and by the 1910 or so, it's clear that hurling was far and away the most popular sport in the county. By 1913, just to give you an idea, There was 41 hurling clubs active that year in different fixtures, and while the championship was often lagging far behind, it was being completed year on year. In terms of Gaelic football, the codification of sports was particularly beneficial for football. Interestingly, initially the Tuam Herald was quite hostile to the new association and Gaelic games, and it threw its lot in with association football, which was beginning to get a little bit of a hold within the county. But it quickly changed its tune as Tuam prospered, more and more participants in Tuam Town played, and Tuam Stars became successful almost from the word go. To be fair, in Galway Town, even the unionist leaning newspapers were at the very least curious and very often supportive of the new association and the new sports, or certainly the codification of historical sports. In terms of actual fixtures, the south and east of the county surprisingly again appear prominently. Mulla, now in the heart of hurling territory, was the first club to have football and hurling sides, albeit they were followed quickly by Kilconnelly, obviously in the heart of football territory, which also fielded a hurling team. And Mulla weren't alone, because some of the sides active that we would associate with hurling today, like Capitagal, Castleblakeney, Clonfert, Aircourt, Gurchy, Kiltormer, Lawrencetown, Leitrim, Mulla, Portumna, Tirnaskra, they all fielded football sides in the opening years of the GAA. It's true, though, to say that the main personalities and administrators in those clubs tended to be hurling players themselves, so their attention over time would lean towards the sliotar rather than the Leabhróid. But simultaneously, the vacuum being left by cricket and its decline was being filled by Gaelic football. So in places like Ballinasloe and Tuam, which were the two hotbeds of cricket in Galway, they became the Gaelic football strongholds. There are many unique aspects to Gaelic football in Galway in comparison to hurling within the county and other counties, and that is, to a far greater degree, they took on nicknames as part of their identity. This is uniquely exemplified by Tuam Krugers and Athenry de Wets, both named after South African heroes, and this, of course, during the Boer War period. And other clubs utilised names that reflected Irish lore or Irish political heroes, or indeed local icons. And just to give you a brief example of some of the more active clubs, Mycullen Sarsfields obviously took the name of Patrick Sarsfields. Kilkerran Dillons were named after the Irish Parliamentary Party politician John Dillon. Corofin Nolans were also named after a politician, the local nationalist MP John P. Nolan. Kilbannon Mandevilles were named after the Fenian John Mandeville. Ballymoe Mitchells named after the young Islander, of course, John Mitchell. Other clubs took a simpler approach, and Tuam Stars, as we would now know them today, were actually known as Tuam Shamrocks in 1888 before taking on the name Stars in 1889. In terms of camogie, camogie emerged in the early 20th century inspired by the wider Gaelic revival. The rules were based on hurling. Initially pitches were shorter, the teams were 12 aside, and the games actually only lasted 50 minutes. Up to then, women's sport, in as much as is documented in the early 20th century, appears to have been a middle class or upper class affair. The sports we're talking about are cycling, hockey, tennis, and actually golf. And while initial efforts in 1904 bore some fruit, it was actually in 1906 that we see real growth in terms of camogie in Galway. Ballygar were established, Montbellier were established in May 06 as well, Uachtarard in June. And it was said on the establishment of the Uachtarard Club that those connected with it were to be kept in touch with that Irish Ireland, which is not alone in reviving the Irish language, but everything which tends to nationalise our country. It will keep our fair sex from trying to imitate the accent and manners of the local gentry. So you can see the Gaelic revival elements crying out from their establishment. The same month saw Athlone travel to meet Galway City, with the Athlone entertained in Salthill after the fixtures, and there were very, very social gatherings, as indeed were the hurling and football fixtures. Camogie's progress did slow, and that was due to poor organisation, inconsistency in the imposition of rules. The rules were actually published only in Irish. So we had latterly there would have been a reorganisation in 1923, but in 1911 there was a reorganisation which also bore fruit under a Camogie Association. It's worth looking at the AGM for the Galway Camogie Board in 1918. And they said that their focus was on maintaining an independent association to that of the GAA, which we might think now is interesting because we're now looking at the merger of camogie and ladies football in under the umbrella of the GAA. And at that meeting, the chairman noted that ladies were free citizens in the new republic and they would wish for an organisation of their own. In terms of other sports, the perception of some historians was that it was a case of either or, but as I said at the very outset, you have many of the same personalities playing several sports. So it wasn't just a choice between sport A and sport B or sport A and sport D. Many men and women played various different sports. And while there was indeed a GAA ban on foreign sports in every county, ways were being found around it. They were being circumvented. In County Galway, it was rugby that seems to be the most regular offender in terms of men, and hockey for women. But these people who were being led astray were often allowed back into the fold, and leniency was very often shown, with reasons found to show leniency. A sport that gets overlooked in Galway is hockey, and there were several hockey sides in the run-up and indeed during the revolutionary period. Galway Town, Montbellew, the Grammar School in the city, Rilmore Barracks, Gart and others all sporadically fielded hockey teams. Both men and women teams competed, and perhaps the strongest side was in Ballinasloe, and Ballinasloe Asylum actually won a national title, with many men who would have graced the hurling field in previous years and indeed subsequent years. Other sports received much less coverage. The focus on rugby, for example, was almost exclusively on schools and colleges rugby. It's interesting, the Galway Express on the 29th of March 1919 noted the growth of rugby in the city, and it had a shot at the Catholic Church, which it didn't do often, particularly St. Joseph's Seminary, for supporting and playing rugby, describing it as a step backwards in the national struggle. The same paper shared decreasing coverage of non-GAA sports in this period. They were now very much in the crosshairs in revolutionary Ireland. On the 3rd of March 1920, again the Galway Express reported that the Lawn Tennis Club at Salt Hill had been burnt to the ground, with croquet and tennis pitches dug up. Elsewhere, athletics and cycling received sporadic coverage. Unofficial sports, and particularly athletics, received a reasonably good coverage. The coverage of association football, already limited, greatly diminished in the 1913 to 1923 period. I think it's important to look at the players, because very often we just say teams' names and we don't get behind who the participants were. And at the remove of a century, it's probably challenging to read too much into what information can be garnered. But some fundamental questions can be answered about the players through a basic socioeconomic profile of sides. So the methodology I've used has been to profile sides against the 1901 and 1911 census. Now, complicating factors are that several players played for one or more clubs. That was the case of ringers, particularly evident in cricket, but the GAA weren't behind the door of doing it as well at times. In addition, there were cases where players could not be identified with absolute certainty, so I've excluded those. But the findings make for a challenge to the perceived assumptions. So in short, a stronger case can be made that cricket was more inclusive than hurling against the wider Irish society at the time. All classes are reflected in the study on Galway cricket sides, albeit players are weighted more heavily in favour of professionals, and this grouping included landed gentlemen and professionals such as solicitors. The age profile of cricketers was higher at 27 years, and the percentage of married players at 37% was higher than in studies for hurling or football. The agricultural class is underrepresented at 40%, where it would have been 79% in the wider county-wide in terms of non-productive being excluded. And the age profile of hurlers, just as an example, was 24. Far fewer of them were married. All classes are reflected in reasonable numbers in the cricket analysis, while in the GAA, to be fair, they could not make that boast, because the majority of hurlers, 83% of them, were engaged in agriculture. So just as cricket may have been the preserve of an exclusive few at its outset, it's evident that Gaelic Games was also somewhat exclusive through design or through just how matters progressed. And in their case, labouring and poorer classes were hugely represented. And indeed, the game was evolving in this period, in the revolutionary era, into a wholly Catholic and, as events would demonstrate, nationalist organisation. Now, given the limited pool of camogie players, it's a little bit more difficult to derive any analysis because we're not getting full teams listed on what games were being played. But it is interesting to note that Galway University won the 1917 Ashbourne University Cup, which was a huge achievement, but that several of the players refused to have their name engraved on the cup in Irish, which might reflect their political leanings or certainly their views. In terms of the revolutionary years themselves, by this period the links between nationalism and the GAA was undeniable. The extent to which GAA members, men and women, participated in the 1916 Rising are given detailed attention by historians and have been, particularly, as I said, in GAA and camogie anthologies. Ultimately, the GAA was a sporting organisation, certainly up to Easter Rebellion in 1916, you could make that case, and that it was largely independent of national political affairs, but 1916 changed all that. Just to give you an insight into how the RIC looked at matters, in 1913 one sub-inspector noted that the GAA clubs are chiefly concerned with their games and do not display disloyalty, but that is not a saying they're loyal. Desmond Fitzgerald complained that too many young men prefer to play Gaelic games when they should have been drilling, in his mind. And indeed, prior to the Rising, authorities did suspect some GAA members of being involved in nationalist or Republican activities. Some were imprisoned, but it was really the cack-handed approach of British authorities post the 1916 rebellion. It fulfilled, or it created a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of Sinn Féin activity. In his study of the IRA, Robert Lynch noted that many Irish volunteer companies were thereafter formed around the nucleus of a football or a hurling team. So after the Rising, clubs then began to fundraise for the prisoners, which were previously their teammates and their members. And as noted by Pádraig O'Leary in his excellent Annals of the GAA in Galway, 2 volumes, the backbone of the GAA in County Galway was Larry Lardner, George Nichols, Stephen Jordan and Messrs Cusack, Ruane, O'Kieran, Trayers and Fallon had all been arrested and sent to internment camps, effectively cementing the people behind Sinn Féin policy and caused them, in the election of 1918, to reject nationalists. Public meetings were proclaimed in July 1918 and save the 4th of August bumper calendar, few fixtures took place for the remainder of the year. An additional issue in promoting and reporting on GAA, as with all sports, continued to be the scarcity of paper. Editions of newspapers and indeed coverage inevitably shrinked as a result due to the Great War. And transport was also more challenging during the Great War. And in addition to all of those factors at home and indeed abroad, another issue which dogged the GAA was immigration. Hundreds and thousands of Galway men immigrating to the United States, thereby taking the backbone of these organisations with them. The main centres of GAA activity abroad was in the big cities in the United States. However, Gaelic games continued to be played from Buenos Aires to Melbourne in this period. The extent of the reporting on American newspapers, which you can see in the slide, was particularly impressive. Some of these men may have been escaping warrants in this period, but it's more likely that many were simply forced abroad by poverty and unemployment. So again, just to revisit the 4 sports and activity during the revolutionary period, the coverage of cricket matches in local and newspapers and national newspapers greatly reduced. Indeed, in County Galway, there's no report of any cricket matches during the Great War, during those 4 years. Clubs were relying more and more in cricket on older players, and few of those interests dared to be seen as anything other than Republican. The factors in the demise of cricket varied between counties. Patrick Home, for example, in his book Cricket in Ireland, attributes golf as a factor. But given County Galway boasted only a handful of golf clubs, and with the financial and time demands of such a sport, clearly this may have been an issue in Dublin, less so in Galway. Instead, in Galway, what drove players from the sport was the changing socio-political climate, and I'm particularly talking about the decline of the landed estates. The sport of cricket grew out of the landed estates in County Galway. The decline of the landed estates saw the decline of cricket. The Great War would also deal a devastating blow to cricket with the death of so many of those most supportive of the sport, including famously Robert Gregory, he of an Irish airman foresees his death, a man who took a particular interest in Gaelic games as well, as is often known. To a lesser extent, the Great War did impact the GAA community. It lost some great stars like James Reds Egan of Loughrea, who was possibly the greatest hurler Loughrea ever produced, and Jack Ruffley of Galway St Patrick's, who was an outstanding hurler in the city. And you know, perhaps the strongest indication of how the sporting winds had changed was in former cricket strongholds like Clontuskert, where the parish established a hurling team in July 1917. A victory followed in the first hurling match played in that area for many years, setting the club on track for a fierce rivalry with Killimer over subsequent years. Nearby, Gaelic football in Ballinasloe, the birthplace of cricket in the country, not just in Galway, the stronghold of cricket in County Galway, was going from strength to strength, with the Ballinasloe town fielding 2 teams, the second of which drew with another former cricket stronghold, Kilconnell, in July 1917. And the football club the same month, or the football final, excuse me, the same month, was hosted by former county cricketer Sir Henry Grattan Bellew, with the great majority of those present giving an elaborate display of Sinn Féin colours. Times had undoubtedly changed. During the War of Independence, there was no reference to cricket in County Galway newspapers. The climate was quite toxic now. In July 1921, the cricket pavilion in Athenry was burnt to the ground with an IRA volunteer trapped inside. After the truce in July 1921, the first cricket match in Ballinasloe for 5 years took place between the town and the military. Ballinasloe did play Lawrencetown in 1924, but it was proving difficult to rouse players even in the changed background. In terms of hurling in the revolutionary period, the spread of championship winners gives an indication of the strength of hurling in this era. There was 5 different winners. Tina and Kilkenarden both reached 5 finals. Tina won 2, lost 2 and shared 1 with Kilkenarden when they both elected not to play the 1921 final over the prisoners issue. Kilkenarden meanwhile won 1 and lost 3 of their other finals. Gort won 2 of 4, Woodford won 2 of 3, Crowell won both theirs, and Galway Town lost in the 23 final. This was also an era when the junior championship was equivalent to the modern hurling championship, and again we have a great geographic spread of clubs from 14 to 19, with Portumna, Tina, Athenry, Abbey, Capitagal and Gorchin all fielding sides and indeed championship winning sides. Following the 1916 rising, some clubs suffered in terms of having players interned, and their results suffered as a result, and I'm thinking about Kilkenarden and Crowell and Castlegar and so on. And the years up to 1923 were particularly disturbed ones, so the championship was fallen very, very far behind. The War of Independence had brought a unity, but it brought delays in terms of matches taking place. And games were increasingly prohibited, fixture backlogs were inevitable, and then we have the disunity of the Civil War period, which was very, very difficult period for the GAA. Many players were also killed, it's worth remembering. Most notably Martin Rooney from Crowell in July 1922. It's quite remarkable then that Galway was able to win the 1923 hurling final. It says a lot about the people, a lot about those involved in GAA at the time, that they were able to navigate that path between pro and anti-treaty. In the aftermath of the Civil War, it was suspected that the issue that was going to divide the GAA was the prisoners issue, and when prisoners, anti-treaty prisoners, were going to be released. But the GAA held firm and again managed to plot a middle path, with many of the major personalities being anti-treaty in outlook or in activity, but nonetheless putting the sport above politics. In terms of Gaelic football, Ballinasloe dominated the football championship now, because the entire town had gotten behind it, and indeed they dominated for 2 decades from 1913. Of the 9 football finals in the 11 years from 13 to 23, Ballinasloe won them all. Tuam Stars were next best, going down in 5 finals. It's worth looking on the factors of Ballinasloe's success. The mix of people in Ballinasloe is a factor, but they certainly had the power of numbers, where cricket was almost gone. Hurling was very much a second sport. But they do deserve much credit for developing great players for the county team. I would believe the major factor was the Ballinasloe Town League, and it comprised of Derry Mullen, Poolboy, the town side itself, the asylum side, and they helped deliver players. The location where they were able to travel to Roscommon, Westmeath and elsewhere for fixtures also helped. Just to give you an idea of the strength of Ballinasloe, as well as the main side, by 1917 they had 3 junior sides. 13 of the Galway team, which defeated Cavan to win the de facto All-Ireland final in 1925, were all Ballinasloe players. They were also less affected during the revolutionary years, and that's key. If we look at Montbellew, they had far fewer players to pick from. They had greater hurdles. They had hurling on their doorstep, and they would lose players like Michael Mullen, who died in British custody in 1921, and they would lose very many players, not just through imprisonment, but through immigration. The GAA's most explicit act of resistance I've touched on a few moments ago, which was on Sunday, August 4th, 1918. And all around the 32 counties, the GAA directed that as many matches take place as possible. And in Galway, it's unclear how many matches did take place because we have only sporadic newspaper reports, but we do get reports from Galway Gael's victory over Mycullen, Gorteen's victory over Barnajarrag, and hurling fixtures are also reported on. The feedback loop from that in terms of the newspaper coverage was those newspapers who were Redmondite in perspective were very critical of the GAA, and they said that the GAA had descended more and more into the troubled sea of politics, with matches recognised as Sinn Féin demonstrations. After August, the troubles escalated as the association had to abandon all matches in the county. In terms of camogie in the revolutionary period, it was actually very active. By the revolutionary era, camogie has been promoted more and more outside the school system. Exhibition matches with the Gaelic League took place alongside festivals. And one great factor in camogie's growth was the fact that it had no competition. So we don't get a Gaelic Football Association for ladies until half a century later. So it had its own way, and camogie was particularly strong in football areas. The sport's progress had slowed after initial fervour, but it had never stalled. In the case of Galway, rural and urban ladies alike continued to embrace the sport, and after the referenced AGM in March 1918, a refocus on fixtures saw the first camogie match of the season take place in Ballinasloe Fair Green in May, with teams representing Cumann and Derrymullen Colony. Portumna also hosted a Cumann team, as did various other towns in Galway, most notably Galway Town. And if we look at the fixtures for the 1918 championship, we get a good view of the geographic spread, with hurling and football areas alike represented. So we'd Kilmacduagh against Ardrahan, Loughrea versus Kilnadima, Kilbeakenty Abbey, Galway Skehana, Kilconnell, Clegmore, Ballinasloe, Portumna, Montbellew versus Mylock in a nice derby in county there, Ballymacward versus Minla, another one, and Ballinamore versus Gorteen. Now, while the Camogie Association formally, like the Gaelic League itself, was officially non-political, very many of its members were involved in Cumann. At Kilbeakenty in June, a camogie match was played, and when the RIC request to stop wasn't heeded, the RIC actually charged the crowd. In July, the newspapers of the county reported on mixed marching, again with camogie players. And the same month, it was a case of cat and mouse being the headline in Ballinasloe, as the Portumna Colony, coming to play Ballinasloe, outwitted the RIC by pretending to play on the east side of the town, and instead the match was played on the west side of the town. Later the same month, a fixture between Gorteen and Skehana was prohibited by police, as was Cartoon and Tuam at the same venue. So matches now had to take place in secret, so we only get fewer and limited reporting of matches. In 1919, only 4 matches were reported on, and that was Kilkenairn's 2-goal victory over Kilnadima, Clostoken's draw with the latter, and Lochstra's triumph over Abbey and draw with Kilconnell. So now to look at the issue immediately post the treaty and independence. The prisoners' issue remained the biggest threat. Concerted effort was made by the GAA in 1924 to stop all games until the 2000 political prisoners were released, and the move was tried indeed on a few occasions at county board level, but failed each time. Officials and players alike chose to proceed with fixtures, notwithstanding the new imperfect state that existed. Unsurprisingly, hurling and football bounced back strongest in 1924 and 1925. Ballinasloe and Tina were now the undisputed kings in football and hurling respectively, while clubs like Anadown and Corofin in football and Mary and Ardmore in hurling were emerging. Camogie too progressed in the 1920s. Newspaper coverage was increasing, and at least 20 matches were reported on in 1928. The following year saw even greater coverage and a bumper season with 10 senior sides, namely Ballinasloe, Craigs, Corandrum, Derrydonal, Headford, Kilkenarden, Moore Park, the Technical Institute in the city, UCG and Westonians. Meanwhile, in 1925, a century after its birth, in Ballinasloe were unable to field a cricket team. By midsummer, no matches had been arranged, and what followed for the rest of the decade was a period of absolute silence, with no newspaper reports of what cricket fixtures may have been played. A brief effort at revival was made in 1930 and 31, but for cricket the game was up. The new state would make it clear where it stood. By 1930, Galway County Council scholarships were only provided to those attending schools in which rugby, soccer, hockey and cricket were not played. And bizarrely, a 50 to 75% duty was put on cricket equipment by the state. The role of the GAA in healing wounds in this period, post the Civil War, was shared by Olay again in his annals, and he has said it's to the credit of the GAA in County Galway that it played a vital role in bringing and keeping men from both sides of the Civil War together. When, in due course, the fighting had ended and the men in prison were all freed, it was the GAA club that rebuilt the friendships broken by the Civil War. William Murphy, in his study of the GAA during the Irish Revolution 1913 to 1923, questions the limits of the association in an era as a force of reconciliation and in its capacity to influence the environment around it. He stated activities had more impact on the GAA than the association and its members had on the revolution, and he cites two examples of prevailing hostility. While the view of the GAA as a playground of the revolution rather than a player is a legitimate one, in County Galway the association's role was unmatched by other sports in terms of reconciliation. Anti-treaty men like Larry Lardner and Steve Jordan played what Olay termed a noble part in administering the GAA, and also in terms of refereeing games, and doing so impartially and with consensus. In 1933, a decade after the end of the revolutionary period, the tiny club of Mary won the main seven-a-side, intermediate and senior county titles in hurling in the one calendar year, all with the youngest ever side to win the county title, where 2/3 of the players were aged 20 and under. They played with a fresh and free-flowing passing style. And the story of Mary captured the hearts of the entire county in 1933. Willie Hannifey, who captained the team, he later joined the priesthood and was a priest in the States, remarked, "The disastrous Civil War left in its aftermath in Mary, as everywhere else, a legacy of acrimony, bitterness and division. The Mary team, in its quest for top hurling honours, engendered in the whole district, by its many victories, a wave of excitement, enthusiasm, goodwill and togetherness. All feuds were forgotten, recrimination ceased to be, and all wounds were healed. Unity and a great sense of pride was restored to the parish. I personally believe that was a greater and harder thing to do than winning the County Cup, great as that was." Thank you.